you'll see more and more focus from regulators and also from investors. But at the same time, it means that everybody wants it in a specific way because it's so important now. In the past, it was voluntary. It was a nice to have, putting a CSR report out there. But today, whatever you're publicly putting out there is a critical piece of information.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and I'm glad to be with you today. Thank you so much for being with me as well. Today, we are bringing to you episode number 48 of the podcast. And today, in this episode, this is the final part of our three-part series on ESG. So really appreciate you joining us on this journey as we discussed ESG over the past couple of weeks. Today's episode, we are joined by Fulya Kocak, who is the SVP of ESG at Nareit. And we are kind of discussing the intersection of ESG and real estate broadly, is what I would say. For those of you unfamiliar with what Nareit is, it is the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts. And I guess it's hard to really summarize, but generally speaking, it's a very, very massive place of influence on the real estate market. So suffice to say, Fulya has really been doing highly impactful work through what she's doing at Nareit. And as always, we had a lot of different things we discussed in the podcast today, but some of those include how ESG plays a role in the real estate space. Specifically, we went into what is a REIT, for those unfamiliar, and then we also discussed the effects of ESG and on design, or if there are any, adverse effects. We discussed the standard objections people have to collecting ESG and reporting ESG data. And then, of course, we talked about, generally speaking, what does the process look like for ESG reporting for real estate owners, and a whole lot of other things. So really great conversation in general. I'm really excited to be able to share this with you. It's such an honor to speak with her. So again, before we get into the show, we always want to make mention and thanks to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, ESG, and technology spaces globally. So if your team is growing and you're looking to hire more people, or perhaps you are looking to make a career change, please do consider reaching out to NextWave. You can reach them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And again, NextWave, really great depth of knowledge in their consultants, of course, working across the climate tech space inside of real estate as well. So consider reaching out to them today. And without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really, really excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for a while now. So I guess, do you want to just give us a quick introduction to yourself and kind of what you are doing today?
Sure. I'm Fulya Kocak. I'm a Senior Vice President of ESG issues at Nareit. Nareit is the trade association representing publicly listed real estate companies and real estate investment trusts. I also, I'm an author. I'm an instructor around ESG and sustainability topics. And yes, that's me. I've been in sustainability for 20 years now. I started in the green building side, and eventually I migrated into real estate. So I know the side of design, construction, and engineering, and I know the side of real estate as far as sustainability and ESG is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Could you, I'd be really keen to understand, maybe it sounds like there was kind of two impetuses, right? Initially, you started into the kind of the green building space from maybe a design perspective. Mm-hmm. What was the impetus to get into that? And then what eventually led you to kind of dig deeper into ESG specifically?
I always say this, I used to think that it was coincidence, but I was at the right place at the right time, learning about the right things. So when I was in graduate school at Penn State, U.S. Green Building Council was piloting these workshops for something called LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. So that was the first time I was introduced to green buildings at Penn State. And right after that, I took the LEED exam and became one of the first LEED APs in the world. So at the time, no one knew about LEED, and I was learning about it. I was getting excited. And when I was looking for a job, I chose a company that really cared for sustainability. And I joined as a construction manager, But soon I did things voluntarily, helped project teams with sustainability since I was one of the two lead credentialed professionals at the time, one of which was the director of sustainability. I was assigned to the largest LEED certified project at the time. So that was my introduction to green buildings and LEED, because I learned about it before anyone else did. I feel the same for ESG after many years in construction, helping construction companies and building their sustainability programs from scratch. I did it twice. I was asked to join Nareit to start an ESG program for the real estate investment trust industry, REIT industry. So again, ESG was not a very well-known concept at the time. We were trying to define it for the whole industry. And it was more of a nice to have, not as it is today. And again, I was at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, ESG. So that's my story of getting involved initially with green buildings on design and construction side, and then later on doing that for the whole industry around ESG.
Mm. And could you maybe talk about, I guess there's a lot of things that we could go into from here, but I'd be keen if you could talk a little bit about some of the writings that you've put out, some of the thought pieces on this. Could you just go through some of those? Because I think there's a lot of interesting things we could dig into from there.
Sure. The first book I published was for the U.S. Green Building Council. Since I became a lead AP, I was teaching LEED concepts and helping other professionals with their credentials, exam preparation presentations and LEED presentations. Eventually, I was asked to author the book for exam preparation. So that was my first published book. And then I also decided that a lot of people were asking me about my career and how I got to where I was. So I decided that I can write my story into this sustainability leadership book. And I wrote the Sustainability Leader in You. And the whole idea behind that book is that you don't have to have the title. You don't have to have that kind of a job, but you can be a sustainability leader regardless of where you are and what you're doing. So I gave examples from my career, but also inspiration and encouragement of doing that since I started as a LEED credentialed person that volunteered and created tools for the company without having the title initially. So those were the two published pieces. But then I thought to myself that online learning is becoming a more feasible way for professionals, especially busy professionals, to learn. So I connected with LinkedIn Learning, and I became the first instructor to speak about green buildings and LEED. Right now, I have 5 courses on LinkedIn Learning with tens of thousands of learners around the world. I just completed my Green Jobs for Sustainable Careers course, and now I'm starting Introduction to ESG. So my hope is that whatever I learn and any perspectives I gain, any way I can share that with as many professionals as possible, that's a big part of who I am. I always add education to my job description, regardless of what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important. Obviously, if you've been one of the first people in the space in 2 instances, at least, you have kind of a responsibility to pass it along and to keep growing it. Could you perhaps speak to, before we get into too deep, could you just kind of explain for anybody not familiar, could you explain what a REIT is?
A REIT is a real estate investment trust. It's a publicly traded real estate company. And it's the tax structure that makes a REIT REIT, because 90% of the earnings are distributed back to stakeholders. So it's really a tax structure that REIT has to pass the test to be called a REIT. Mm-hmm. But they are publicly traded and publicly listed companies.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess from a ESG perspective, what are the kind of key aspects of ESG for real estate owners or for REITs specifically? I guess we've talked, on previous shows of the episode or previous episodes of the show about ESG in general, but we've never talked specifically about how it affects real estate.
Sure. The way ESG started within real estate was with the E. And with the E, it was the energy side, energy efficiency initially, and of course, green buildings. Later on in time, The E component also grew into other aspects of E, climate change being on top of it right now. And we've seen a big evolution in the last couple of years in the area of S. The way it's seen in the real estate industry is, I see it as two components. One is doing it, implementing ESG strategies, and two is disclosing on it. So there may be companies that are public that are doing a great job with ESG, but they may not be disclosing. But a public company, as you know, is a very transparent corporation. So we see more disclosures from REITs because they are public companies. Their stakeholders care for these disclosures. And actually, investors, of course, make decisions based on these disclosures. ESG is a part of these disclosures. So when you ask for real estate in general, for real estate, E covers today the climate, energy, just not only from an efficiency perspective, but also renewables. It covers now biodiversity is a huge part of it that's growing. Any resource efficiencies and green buildings, that's the E component. Again, climate change is on top as a very urgent issue. On the S side, you can define it again for the whole real estate or any corporation. Actually, S is quite equal for many. Human capital, any people that you touch, so the community engagement, that philanthropy, probably most people know it as philanthropy, but community engagement is a little more extensive than just writing a check or volunteering time. And for a real estate company, the unique part is the tenants, because tenants are a very important part of the people that a real estate company touches. So on the S side, that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, engagement with tenants and community. It includes human capital related. It could be health and safety, health and wellness, recruitment, turnover, and of course, safety is a huge part of any organization, but on the real estate side, actually, it touches more to the construction aspect. If a real estate company has a huge focus on development, and you'll see more of the safety issues as well. On the G side, more for REITs, I think, it's that the accountability, transparency, the ethics side. So you'll see a bunch of governance policies. It could be from bribery and corruption policies to whistleblower policies. Again, most of this applies to any company. When it comes to S&G, I think it's a little more uniform among different industries other than the tenant engagement piece. But E is very unique to real estate. And on the governance side, we see now more of the ESG governance. I like calling it big G and the little g. There's a traditional governance that's how a company is run and accountability. And then there's a little g that's governance of the ESG aspects, and that is making commitments, board level commitment. Now we hear more and more companies tying the executive compensation to ESG performance, setting goals tied into more globally accepted frameworks. So that's the examples of little g, where what is done within the ESG umbrella is governed at that top level.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That's very helpful, I think, as a general overview. I think I'd be keen to understand, maybe especially probably from the E perspective, given that you had kind of a background in the design and that side of buildings. Do you ever notice any compromises that have to be made when it comes to kind of the intersection of designing something really well to be efficient, but still to be beautiful and to be like a great design, but in a way that it will kind of work well and be environmentally friendly, for example?
That I remember I used to get this kind of question in the past, that I think that was a misunderstanding. A green building is not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, or is more expensive. But a green building, I think when you walk into one, first of all, you'll see more daylight. So that makes things so much more appreciated and appealing. It will have better views because that's a part of a green building. So it's not just about efficiency, but a green building is a very holistic concept where it's about daylight, it's about views, it's about efficiencies, it's about better indoor air quality, it's about better quality within the building and outside of the building, where the site is designed accordingly. It's good for stormwater management, but the rain gardens are also quite attractive. So you can have a very good looking and very well performing green building inside of which people are happier and healthier. So there is no compromise that way. It's a design aspect that it can be holistically integrated in a building. And nowadays we've been doing green buildings for such a long time that it's just a given. I think even with if you're just building, when you buy the equipment today, it comes efficient. It is inherently efficient today. The codes are more based on efficiency. So most times, even the traditional buildings that are built have a lot of the green building components because many of the jurisdictions already integrated these aspects of a building in the coding system.
Mm-hmm. And what have you seen then in terms of challenges or objections in the space with when it comes to, whether it's ESG, implementing an ESG tracking program or reporting? Like what are the key objections that you typically would run into or see from people?
I wouldn't call it objections, but I think the challenges, I can talk a little bit about the different challenges. ESG is evolving at a very fast pace. So the biggest challenge is even its definition keeps changing year over year. So it requires a lot of resources and a full-time staff dedicated to ESG so that that person stays on top of the latest developments, what's going on, all these different ESG frameworks. It's like an alphabet soup. So much is going on that it's hard to keep on top of these changes that are happening very quickly. I think that's the number one challenge, that ESG is not set in stone. It keeps evolving. The demands around it is evolving. And I think the more companies are maturing, the more demand is increasing. So there is no catching up to it. That's how it feels, at least right now. So that's the first challenge. The second one is I keep hearing the burden of disclosures. I mean, disclosures are important. I'm not saying that we should not disclose as an industry. Yet I know many teams, ESG teams, that half of their time or sometimes more goes to disclosures rather than doing what is needed to be done so that the company is advanced in ESG performance. So it is time consuming, but I think it'll get better in time when things are a little more consistent and companies don't have to fill out so many surveys. They are asked to do so many different ESG reporting frameworks. It's a bit, there's a lot of noise and confusion still in the market around ESG.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that it will get to a point in the future where it's kind of like more standardized, or is it going to be very difficult depending on the real estate asset class?
I think there are some common threads for, I think, all real estate companies. When you think about it, for example, climate change applies to all. But for a data center sector versus a storage sector versus an office sector, they will have differences for other aspects of ESG. As long as it's recognized that there are commonalities that we can have a streamlined approach, companies should also have the freedom to customize their strategies based on their operations and what's meaningful for their operations and for their stakeholders. So as long as there is consistency while the flexibility is given for companies to have their custom strategy, again, based on what they're about, that should be solved in time, but I don't see it happening really soon. So it's in the first few years when I started 6 years ago, it was more like, okay, are you disclosing this? Check. Are you disclosing that? Check. That was how it was. But now it's very much about specific metrics and how performance is calculated based on those metrics. And right now there is no full agreement that every investor is taking all these numbers and data and they're putting it into their own black box and coming up with their own way of identifying which company performs better than the other. They also identify risks and opportunities, but it's not apples to apples right now. And that is hard for companies to focus on the right thing because they hear from different investors about different things. So I think it'll be a while, but I have hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm sure it'll work out to some extent. Things always get more efficient, and the market kind of tends to work itself out in a certain way. I'm obviously very keen to see how that ends up shaping out. Um, I guess I'd be keen. It's kind of in line here to understand what are some of the current regulatory landscapes for ESG as it relates to real estate, and what are some of the upcoming potential regulations in the space. And this can be, again, not just specifically for the U.S. and North America, but for other places that you're aware of, kind of their situations.
Sure. I guess you can start with the local jurisdictions and cities. We see more and more of these local efforts around climate change, resilience, and energy benchmarking and performance. So that has been happening for a while now, but it increased, and it's going towards not just taking one aspect, which was in the past energy or green building certifications, but I see that going more towards climate risk and resilience, and of course more disclosures. So that's the local aspects in the US, where increasing number of cities are looking at those as important, not just at the company level, but also overall at that city level. Then in the US, as you're aware, SEC climate change ruling that they are expecting comments. It was extended today, so it'll be later in June. That is also looking at bringing that consistency to climate change-based reporting. And we, of course, we'll know more once the process runs its timeline. Then there is the global aspect of EU. As you know, European Union, Europe has always been ahead in the regulatory work around ESG. There is this thing called EU taxonomy, and it's just defining what ESG means and what sustainable investments mean. And that affects any company, not only in Europe, but any company that has European investors. Because the European investors, they also have to follow the same taxonomy. There are other regulations that are specific to European countries, and also reporting standards around ESG. There are also things such as the green bond framework. Every time I think that I got it all covered, something new is coming up as being standardized or regulated. And my biggest, I guess, concern is when you have the European regulations, US regulations, and all these other regions with their own regulations, if you have a global company, how could that company address all of these regulations and report in a way that is in compliance globally? That, again, adds more to the burden of reporting and making it, maybe they need to report 3 different ways if they have 3 different locations or regions that are asking for 3 different ways of reporting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would assume that there'll be perhaps at some point kind of maybe a consolidation, because in the long run, these things should all be science-based and they should be very similar, right? Is that accurate, that there's a lot of similarities there?
There are some similarities, yes. And I think that there are some respected frameworks, such as greenhouse gas protocol, that is usually referred in some of these documents. But again, I just don't want to say yes for sure. Everything is moving right now. Everything is moving in the world around ESG, both regulation and corporate efforts. So we're at a place where it's no longer an interest, but a very core aspect of businesses. And it's no longer a nice to have add-on, but it's in the core of financial performance. At least that's how it's seen because of the risk factors. So you'll see more and more focus from regulators and also from investors. But at the same time, it means that everybody wants it in a specific way because it's so important now. In the past, it was voluntary. It was a nice to have, putting a CSR report out there. But today, whatever you're publicly putting out there is a critical piece of information.
Mm-hmm. What has been the primary force driving the change? Has it been individuals? Has it been the corporations themselves? Has it been government? Like what has actually driven this change towards more widely accepted that real estate companies are, especially REITs, are reporting this data?
I can speak to the REITs and I can just tell you about my speculations because the biggest momentum has been during the quarantine time in the last 2 years. And I think that was a good wake-up call to show a crisis, a risk that can have such a big impact in the world. And that was eye-opening and a wake-up call that ESG risks are quite material financially, because that is the same thing. It was an S risk. And of course, we also had quite a bit of a painful experience with social unrest as well at the same time. So I think that was eye-opening for all of us, individually, as corporations, as investors, that all these risks, such as climate risk, health risk, they are all important and they should be considered. But then data is critically important, yet if it's not apples to apples, it's hard for anyone to measure and compare. So my guess is that the last 2 years and what we've been through really was an important wake-up call to show that ESG, what falls under ESG, the environmental issues, the social risks, they can all affect the whole world, not a single corporation, all at once. And in addition to that, I think the investors are becoming more educated. They now have a better way of understanding how ESG can affect performance. We see more disclosures from corporations because they can want all they want, but if the corporations aren't disclosing, they can't just take this data and make sense of it. So I think a lot of things are moving in the right direction. Investors are asking for it, companies are disclosing on it, and the risks are on top of the priority list when it comes to ESG.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, very good. I'd be keen to move next into how is ESG reporting done today? Kind of what does the process look like typically? How much is automated? How much is manual? And maybe, as along with that, how do you see that changing and going forward in the future? Do you see it adjusting? Like, what are you anticipating there?
ESG reporting, I can speak to it based on my experience in the REIT world. So at the basic level, the smaller companies may still be using their website for disclosing on ESG. So you can see this information on a sustainability page. They can even have metrics listed there. So that's the most basic way of disclosing on ESG, just putting it on a web page. Then if they want to take it to the next level, they can have their standalone CSR report, corporate sustainability report. That typically follows GRI, the global, okay, now I'm just completely blanking out.
Global Reporting Initiative, I believe.
Yes, Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. And if they choose to do that, they do a materiality assessment and identify what's material. I'm not talking about financial materiality. What's material for the organization under ES and the G, and they identify a number of key issues, and that's what they report on in their CSR. Now, this is changing because more and more companies are now tying TCFD and SASB into their CSR. So what we used to see was a GRI metrics at the end of the CSR report that would just say, hey, page X for energy, such and such. Now we see the same metrics for TCFD, and I see more and more of SASB being referred to in the CSR report. So the nice to have CSR report that was a voluntary piece of document that mostly aligned with GRI. Now we see a lot of these investor requested ESG frameworks, mostly on the climate side, being referred to in the CSR documents. In addition to that, companies may choose to have other third-party reporting guidance documents or actual scoring documents. So for example, GRESB is a real estate-based ESG framework that scores companies based on their ESG performance. That is very much real estate specific, and companies can get a score from 0 to 100. It also compares them with their peers. You can also have another company that may choose to do CDP for climate disclosures. So There are companies that would just go as basic as websites, putting their information on a web page for sustainability. And there are companies that may have 5 to 6 different ESG reporting frameworks that they utilize all at once and report in different ways because their stakeholders are asking a specific framework to be followed. Now, what I expect to change in the next few years is with the SEC ruling on climate change, I think we'll see more companies. Of course, it'll be compliance requirement that they have to put ESG criteria in their financial documents. So we'll see more of this information in the financial documents as a part of the financial reporting. We haven't seen it as much until recently, but I expect to see more of that happening.
Mm-hmm. And are there any specific areas in terms of maybe the mechanics of actually going through the reporting structure where you see big rooms for innovation?
We need big innovations. I will just say that there's rooms for innovation, but at the same time, first let's cover the parts that we have to innovate really quickly. I'd say the climate risk assessments, it's still in its early stages, and companies typically bring a third party with a software that looks at climate risk assessment. But I worry that all these different third parties, we don't know what kind of a climate data they are using. And I have a feeling that, and I've been hearing rumors that depending on the third party that is being used or in-house tools, climate risk looks different for the same company if they use different third-party providers. So the room for innovation is, I think we just have to have that consistency of those risk assessments that regardless of which third party you use or which in-house tool you use, the climate risk, if an investor is looking at the same company, that climate risk number should be the same as the company using another risk assessment tool. If it varies, that's a problem. It just, that becomes another issue with this complication. So that's definitely room for innovation, that consistency of the, I guess, black box that are within those climate assessments, climate risk assessments. Mm-hmm. Room for improvement, I think climate change has a huge room for improvement on the resilience side. It's great, identify the risks, but then what do you do about that? I think that's where we'll see a lot of innovation, and we need innovation. How can you take that risk and turn it into an opportunity? And how can you address that risk so that that asset is not under risk anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess that kind of goes pretty well into the next idea I wanted to go over, which we didn't, you sort of mentioned it in passing, but I'd be keen to maybe hear some more, if you have any more tangible or hard examples of how does ESG reporting make financial sense for a lot of companies, right? Kind of if you took out the factor of regulation and all those items, would it make economic sense to report on all this ESG data? And if so, could you give us some examples of where it's really kind of where it really ends up benefiting these REITs or these real estate owners?
I used to say this for green buildings for metering, but what you can measure, you can manage. And I think I'll add to that, what you can measure, you can manage, and what you manage, you disclose to share that with stakeholders so that they can make decisions. With disclosures, I think the important part of disclosures is that you can have all of this internally, but being accountable means really putting it out there so that the commitments are there, you show the progress, and you're transparent about it. You're accountable for it. That's how I feel about disclosures. And as far as their financial benefits are concerned, if a company is on top of their ESG strategy, that means that they take that strategy, and a part of that strategy is very financial. You can't just do the stewardship, that's great, and the social aspects, that's great as well. But a public company has a responsibility for its shareholders as well. And it's important for the company to be seen as an investable corporation by investors. So the way I look at ESG disclosures is that all that good work, all the strategy that ties into the financials, It's not always energy savings and bills. I'm not talking about just that, but it could be about employee well-being and the retention rates going up. So once you tie that and you disclose on it, that's the financial value right there. You turn that disclosure into an opportunity and a good advantage for being a good investment. That's how I see it. And investors like that because they also look at it as a low risk, because when you disclose, it means that you're on top of it. You have a strategy, you're showing your progress. They are aware of what the company is working on and what their progress looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think also, if I remember correctly, I had somebody else on here mention that oftentimes green buildings and smart buildings can command higher rents as it is too. So I would assume that could really play into it. And obviously, it appears as though the trend is towards everybody having to kind of report on the ESG data, and maybe initially, if you're one of the early adopters to creating a more clean building, you can charge higher rents and have kind of a competitive advantage initially. And with that, maybe averaging out over time as more investors get in, but maybe, it's probably worth the investment up front to be a leader and rather than just charging less than everybody else in the future. So I'd like to move on to one of my favorite parts, and it sounds like it's something of interest to you too, based on the earlier comments, which is kind of just education generally and how it relates to ESG, and whether that be helping, people throughout their high school years, their university, to understand what is ESG, how do we all have an impact on these various factors in our lives and what we do, where we purchase from, and whether or not the universities are helping kind of feed talent into these areas. So could you kind of give us your general thoughts on kind of the intersection of ESG and sustainability with the education space?
Sure. I first want to differentiate ESG from sustainability, because although they may sound similar, they are not the same. ESG is a term used by the investment community, and it became a huge concept. Nowadays, we hear more and more of it. So sustainability is, I think, when you look at sustainability, it doesn't necessarily, it is not the same thing as the ESG aspects. And for example, I see sustainability being taught at an elementary school level or high school, but ESG is more on the business education side. That's my personal thinking. So if I were to create this educational program, I teach social responsibility, sustainability earlier on. And then when you're looking at the college level, all business majors, I think they need to learn sustainability and ESG. And MBAs, I remember a couple of years ago checking the curriculum for MBAs, and they didn't have anything ESG within their curriculum, which was surprising. But now I see more and more MBA programs, including it actually that are MBA programs around ESG. So the education, I'll just separate sustainability education from ESG education. ESG education more on the business side and investment sides, and corporate side, and sustainability education more just letting our children grow up with that understanding of social responsibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sustainability, being good environmental stewards and protecting the planet. On the side of ESG, the education is quite interesting because the biggest opportunity is top to bottom and bottom to top education. We keep hearing board education. Now we're talking about board education on ESG. We're also hearing that everyone coming up the ladder, also they want to understand ESG and make it a part of their role, because in a business, as an employee, you want to provide the most value for your organization while doing the right thing with the environment and while being a good social citizen, good for the society. So the education has incredible potential on the business side, top to bottom and bottom to up. And at the same time, I also think that there's a huge gap with green jobs and talent for green jobs. Again, in addition to ESG, now I'm going to go into that are very specialized areas of the E right now and some of the S that need a lot of training. It could be renewables, it could be energy related jobs, it could be accountants with that financial ESG reporting skill sets. So there is also a very specialized need under E topics and S topics that we need to focus on right now, because we are missing a huge opportunity of training our employees in those areas, very specialized areas. I don't think we have enough professionals in the HR side, for example, with the DEI training and specialization. So again, there's a big picture sustainability for our children. There is the business side with ESG on the investment and corporate performance side. And then there is also the very specialized green skill set under various topics of ENS that we need to cover as far as education is concerned. Was that helpful, or do you want to? The education is very near and dear to my heart, so I can talk about it for a long time.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite interesting, and it's very interesting to hear your perspective on it. I am always curious in terms of helping people find their path, right? Because I have a little bit of a bone to pick with the education system, that it really forces people to try to pick something without having experienced anything, right? And depending on who your parents were and depending how you were raised, you might have a very limited kind of view of what types of jobs there are, right? And this is something that I know there are programs that do something like this. I just heard about one I don't remember which, I think it's University of Waterloo in Canada has a kind of working program where people work throughout their university to get experience that they can then continue specializing. But no, I think that's very interesting. And I'm also very fascinated to see how we fill the jobs, because I agree with you, obviously, as being a talent person during the day, there are a shortage of people to fill these jobs, right? And I think that to some extent, we can't necessarily sit around waiting for everybody to have these 4-year degrees to get into these jobs. Some of them are relatively simple and obviously very well paying, right? Maybe some boot camps or some types of kind of training can get people into these jobs. And then I think personally, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, I do believe that there's a brighter future where companies, in order to maintain retention of talent and make sure that they are being responsible for their employees, that they would continue to help them gain further education, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe they start out with only 6 months of some sort of specific education. And then from there, once they learn the ropes and they can further get into specialization and stay with the company for long term, I do believe that will happen naturally, but I'd be keen if there's, some companies trying to force the issue. And I don't, do you have any thoughts on that and kind of like the employer's role in helping people, continue their education?
Actually, I hear more and more corporations bringing in instructors on ENS topics. I do know that our members are very focused on DEI education. It's not only specialized education, but most of us have unconscious bias. So being aware, I think the education, it's happening slowly but surely. It's definitely not there. More can be done. But I know that right now there's great interest in bringing in instructors to help them create these educational programs for their organizations at every level of organization. But there's so much more to be done. And I do like your idea of boot camps, but at the same time, some of this education takes years. And what I do, and what I hope that other sustainability leaders listening here today, we just have to educate people around us. I go into a meeting, it could be an hour meeting, but I have to educate them on something, and I hope to learn something from them. So I take it upon myself. I don't have to be named the instructor. It doesn't have to be an education session, but I do my best to share that information that is relevant to them so that they can learn even in that 1 hour meeting. Within our organization, not everyone has an ESG title. I'm the head of ESG, but at the same time, cross-departmentally, now everyone speaks the ESG language. It took many years though. It's not a boot camp. So we all have a responsibility to spread the message and teach.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective though, that shift has to happen where people understand that it's not, you have your 4 years or 6 years or whatever of education, then you're set, right? It's going to always be people have to constantly learn from people left, right, above, and below them, right, in terms of the organization structure. And that can create much better teams, much better companies, right? I think that you look at some of the missteps that have happened in, the past 10 years with, major companies and, made big news. And now we have all these sitcoms about them and these documentaries, is if people would kind of learn from each other and not think that, oh, this person must have it figured out because they're the CEO or whatever, right? Though that type of mentality, I think, is really important to a successful business and obviously sustainable business in general too. So, but very good. I think, do you have any other final thoughts or anything else you want to kind of leave us with?
I'm just personally, I'm very excited about the potential. I love when people ask questions around sustainability and ESG. The more we ask, the more we want to learn, the more likely we'll get to those solutions. And this is a great time to not only learn, but be a part of the solution, be creative, think outside the box, and having those diverse ideas and thoughts. It's a great time for those. So I truly hope that if you're listening to us today, just start thinking about ways that you can help, ways that you can solve a piece of this problem, or find us that piece of the puzzle that is missing. Because it's a time where everyone wants to hear you, everyone wants to understand the solutions. I think we are more open to this now. It used to be, I had to beg people to listen to me in the past 20 years ago, but now everybody is interested and excited. So this is a good time to learn, to share, and to bring up these ideas out there. Just let's be excited together. I think that's the only way we'll get to that solution.
Yeah, it's definitely, everybody has to be involved. So I really, really appreciate you coming on, Fulya. Definitely going to have you on again and see what you continue to do. Did you want to mention again your books and anywhere people can reach and kind of follow your things?
Actually, I want to mention the course that's coming up, LinkedIn Learning. It will be published later in July. It's Green Jobs for Sustainable Careers. And I talk about how to strategize to gain these green skills and just to make a decision on how to educate yourself. So that course is coming up, and I hope that you can just check it out once it's out.
Absolutely. That'll be very exciting for many people. I'm very sure. So thank you again so much for coming on today. And we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode. Really hope you enjoyed the conversation with Fulya. If you'd like to hear more about, more of these conversations, more things kind of discussing the climate and ESG space generally, please do subscribe and turn on notifications to be made aware of things upcoming in the future. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we ask please for a review and a rating. It really helps us to boost our exposure across different platforms and to grow and to help spread our message. And of course, if you are looking to sponsor the podcast, we're always open to discussions. You can reach me in the description below. And then please, of course, share this with people who might find it interesting or find the information shared in here valuable for them. If you are interested, we also have a Slack channel for people to get more involved and speak with other professionals in the climate tech space. And then I definitely recommend reaching out to Fulya on LinkedIn to connect with her. She's got a lot of resources. Obviously, she mentioned her book. I think there's a lot of things that her resources that she's created through her time with Nareit could be really, really helpful to a lot of professionals in the space. So definitely consider connecting with her. And then, of course, feel free to reach me on Twitter with any questions you have. And a quick note on our next episode, we will be discussing, we'll be joined by Michael Beckerman, who is the CEO and founder of CleanTech and CleanTech Climate. And we will be discussing kind of a similar topic, which is that of real estate, but it's going to be looking at real estate from the intersection of real estate and climate tech. So sometimes this would be called prop tech, kind of broadly speaking. It's not necessarily, prop tech doesn't really refer only to climate, but I like to refer to the specifics of climate would be climate conscious real estate space. And it's a bit clunky, but generally speaking, that's how I refer to it. So generally, really great conversation with Michael. Really appreciate everybody listening to this episode today and tuning in next week or next time. And thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the podcast, and we'll see you next time on CleanTechies, the podcast.